Hello, everyone. I'm hoping that you just caught me right now. I think I was muted for the first few seconds. Mr. Plog here, and as you saw, Layla just popped in for a little bit to say hi to everyone. Today is Monday, November 2nd, and today we're going to talk about Minnesota and its role in the United States Civil War. Now, if you were at the lower school, I believe last year was the year that you talked about the Civil War in general, right? So this is going to be us picking up from that point, but really talking more about what Minnesota had to do in the Civil War, because it was probably the first real test since it became a state. Now, we talked about it on Thursday, but we'll get back to it, right? Minnesota has just become a state. It was passed by like a 98.5% vote. So if you ended up answering that for extra credit, it was about that. The people wanted Minnesota to become part of the United States officially, right? So in about a 10-year period, we've gone from a backwater, very small territory with barely enough people to be part of the United States to now one of the fastest growing states in all of the United States. Now, Alexander Ramsey, our second governor, is going to head down to Washington, D.C. to have a meeting with Abraham Lincoln. And all of a sudden, Fort Sumter is going to be the first battle of that Civil War. And he just happened to be there at that exact time. So we're going to start today by talking about some effects, but then also what Minnesota did once Alexander Ramsey became the very first governor to commit troops to the Union effort. Okay, so let's get into it. So I just want to do this really quick because I realize that for the most part we should be good, but I still feel like some of us might be struggling with how to actually get to the Google Classroom page correctly. So we're going to go just from the home screen on Google. If you're on Google Chrome, it should look very similar. By the way, where it says go vote, talk to your parents about it. Definitely. Big day coming up. Go to Google Classroom. This is all my class pages. And I'm going to click on social studies, not on the to-do list. Go to classwork. And today is November 2nd. And here we go. So your warm up for today, a house divided cannot stand. What does this mean? Very important for what we're talking about today, because the United States as a whole has become a divided house, right? And what is the main issue that the United States is having at the time? There's really five, but I think overall there's really one. And that issue is slavery, right? Ever since the United States was created, it was a nation of farms, and they decided very early on that they were going to supply the labor needed to work those farms by using slave labor, right? And it's one of the worst areas of Minnesota history. But at the same time, it is something that we need to be honest about, right? And slavery is going to be such a divisive issue for the United States that what's going to end up happening is the United States is going to tear itself apart quite literally through slave labor. Interesting. Well, I know I just saw this not too long ago, so I apologize, ladies and gentlemen. That looked better. Looked better. So another thing to consider when we're talking about Minnesota and the Civil War is that, with Minnesota being as young a state as it was, I feel like there were a lot of people that wanted to prove just how vital that they were to the Union. So keep that in mind as we go through. Okay. So we got five causes of the Civil War. Economic and social differences between the North and the South. And what we're really talking about here is an industrial society in the North and a farming society in the South.
And that society, the farming society, was supplied by slave labor. That was the only way that it made it somewhat profitable and even close to on par with the amount of money that the North was able to produce. The idea of states' rights, there's a 10th Amendment saying that any law that's not made by the United States government is made by the states. Well, does the United States, according to this time in history, have the right to ban slavery? There are a lot of people that say no, the states themselves need to do that. And in the North of the Union, they disagreed with that. Number three, we're already talking about it. Number four, abolition movement just means people that flat out just want to ban slavery on principle. They think it's evil, they think it's immoral, they think it's wrong. And then Abraham Lincoln is really the one that puts the nail in the coffin, right? He is a Republican. He's the first Republican president ever elected. And even though he says that he does not want to ban slavery outright when he's elected, there are a lot of people that think that he will. So when he gets elected, immediately people lose faith, and those in the South that had stayed with the Union, even though they had some big differences, thought that that was the last thing that would definitely doom slavery if they stayed in the Union. Now, Dred Scott is interesting because this is one of the most important Supreme Court cases ever, and it actually originated from Minnesota, which is really, really interesting. So Dred Scott was a slave, and he was a person who was brought into free territories. Namely, one was at Minnesota in Fort Snelling. He actually was a slave at Fort Snelling. And he decided that, wait, I'm in a place that doesn't allow slavery, and I'm being held here. So in that case, if he's a slave in a free territory, does that make him a free person or not? He thought that he was. And he went to the Supreme Court, and it looked like he might win his case. But the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, he decided that because Dred Scott was a slave, he is actually not a citizen, and therefore he's property of somebody else, meaning that he had no right to bring forth a case at all to the Supreme Court because he wasn't a US citizen. This is the worst ruling. I'm just going to say this. Sorry. But it's the worst ruling in the history of the Supreme Court, right? Because you're basically telling someone that they are an object and not a human being. But this case right here basically guaranteed that slavery can exist anywhere, right? So what's stopping someone from taking a whole plantation of hundreds of slaves and moving them to Minnesota or Wisconsin or Iowa, all these places that are supposed to be free, right? There's nothing that's stopping it. If it's not illegal anywhere, it's legal everywhere. So Dred Scott has a very, his chapter starts in Minnesota, but it has countrywide applications. So this was Dred at Fort Snelling with his wife. He lived in small quarters. You can actually go to Fort Snelling, and as far as I know, they keep his living quarters the exact same way that they always used to. It's like a museum. I don't know if they cycle it out, like if they only do it for like certain times of the year, but this is what it would have looked like, right? And he lived with a doctor. So the person that he actually worked for was a military doctor, and that's why he went to all these different free territories, because he was an assistant to that doctor who would see people and help people that were in the military. All right, so we know this story. We've talked about it already, but Minnesota's going to volunteer first, right? Ramsey's going to be in Washington, D.C., and he decides, hey, the time is now. The state's new. Fort Sumter just broke out. I'm going to volunteer troops. Now, of course, Minnesota also has another issue during this time, and that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow, and that's the U.S.-Dakota War. Tensions with the Dakota were not very good at this time. The Traverse des Sioux moved them to that small area, and there were annuity payments, yearly payments, that were guaranteed, and they weren't coming in on time. But for the moment, Alexander Ramsey thought that it was a good time to commit those troops, and he thought that it would be very good for not only himself as a governor, but also for the state's reputation. All right. So one of the very first engagements that Minnesota gets in is at the Battle of Vicksburg, which is one of like the top 3 biggest battles in the Civil War. And then later on,
they end up, the Minnesota 1st Regiment engages at Gettysburg. Now, Gettysburg is known as the farthest battle in the North in all of the Civil War, right? It's in Pennsylvania. It's huge engagement, by far the biggest amount of casualties. And Minnesota played a very key part in it, because what happened is that there was a day or an event called Pickett's Charge, where General Lee, the Confederate or the Southern general, decided to rush all at once. And if they ended up getting to that particular point, what was going to happen is they were going to surround the Union soldiers and would force them to either be killed or surrender. But Minnesota's 1st Regiment came out with their guns at the ready and provided gunfire when there were people rushing at them, so that reinforcements could come up and then engage the Southern troops. So then eventually it was fought as a draw or a stalemate. And that right there could have been an event that changed the entire war and history as we know it. And Minnesota played a key event in that. Now, unfortunately, there was a huge casualty rate for Minnesota soldiers because of that Pickett's Charge, right? A lot were shot and killed, and a lot later would have infections and die from that. But it's crazy to think that Minnesota itself might have actually been the state that caused slavery to be abolished permanently in the United States. Super cool. By the way, if you've ever met Miss Lellman, she actually went to college at Gettysburg, so she knows a lot of that stuff. So this is just a timeline of events. We're not going to get into it. You don't need to take notes on this, but it definitely helps with understanding exactly what happened throughout the course of the Civil War from start to finish. All right. Now, the Civil War is going to change Minnesota, right? Eventually, the Union's going to sew itself back together. Homestead Act's going to be passed, and a whole bunch of people are going to move out here. But Minnesota's reputation really starts here during the Civil War. It had only been a state for a couple years, but people hear all these heroic stories of these guys that came from Minnesota and stopped Pickett's Charge and maybe got rid of slavery permanently, right? So when people are looking for places to branch out, Minnesota is one of the very first places that they think of because of this reputation. They're really, honestly, I think that the Civil War in general is one of the worst chapters in American history, but at least Minnesota definitely has the reputation built off of that. And I really think that that's what contributed to it becoming as populous of a state that it is today. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have today. So I'm going to go back to here really quick. Let's just go check out that exit ticket. All right. You got 4 questions, and what it's asking you is support for suffrage. So suffrage, it sounds like a terrible word, right? And you would think that it means suffering, but it actually doesn't. What suffrage is the ability to vote. And because Minnesota was such a pioneer and was so revolutionary with their actions in the Civil War, women's suffrage, or the right to vote, really starts to take hold immediately following the Civil War, because slavery got abolished and people that were former slaves are now getting the right to vote. So women are going to take that as their time to get the same rights that freed slaves would get, so that they can cast their vote and make a difference, right? So that's what that means. All right, ladies and gentlemen, have yourselves a great day. The day I'm filming this is the day that the Packers and the Vikings play, so fingers crossed. And for those of you that are going to be in school, maybe you'll see me wearing a Green Bay Packer mask. We'll see. Hopefully. All right. Have a great day.